During the 1980s, A Nightmare on Elm Street first introduced audiences to the iconic horror character Freddie Kruger. But as unsettling as the movie was, the true story that inspired director Wes Craven's creation of the supernatural killer is equally disturbing. This week, we examine the terrifying curse of the Dab Tsog. As a blanket of heavy rainfall continued to roll in over the San Francisco Bay Area, the duty night detective for the Oakland Police Department sought shelter in a shop doorway. It was December of 1981, and in addition to the unrelenting downpour, it was also the coldest month of the year. Cursing under his breath whilst he shook the water from the sleeves of his now saturated overcoat, he watched impassively as a couple of EMTs removed the body of the deceased from the apartment block on the opposite side of the street. The case was as unwelcome to him as it was inexplicable. Homicides and robberies were continuing to rise in the city at large as a flood of crack cocaine flowed into the streets of San Francisco. And now, he was also saddled with investigating the mysterious death of Mr. Pang. An unassuming factory worker with no criminal record or known medical issues, the 35-year-old Laotian migrant had passed away suddenly in his sleep without warning or explanation. With no apparent signs of injury or trauma, the only evidence as to how the deceased had met his end was provided by Mrs. Pang, who had been with him when he died. The woman was understandably traumatized by what had just occurred, but had managed to relate the incident using broken English. She had been awoken from a deep and restful sleep by the violent movements of her husband as he convulsed erratically beside her. The dead man's widow explained that when she turned over to investigate, he had appeared to be struggling in his sleep, as if trying to haul himself up off the bed into a seated position. He then began to lash out with his arms, seemingly in an attempt to fight off an unseen attacker. Her desperate efforts to rouse him had failed, with his frantic and violent actions continuing, despite the fact he still seemed to be fully asleep and completely unaware of her intervention. Whilst she watched helplessly, his wild movements suddenly ceased, and her husband let out an anguished cry before going completely limp. He was declared dead as soon as the ambulance had arrived. With the body now on its way to the morgue for further examination, and the bereaved wife being comforted by members of the local community, there was little more to be done. As the police officer stepped back out into the rain and headed for his car, he found himself irritated by two details of the investigation that he knew would make the case a difficult one for him to file. The first was the revelation that this was the 18th seemingly healthy member of the Hmong community to die in identical circumstances that year alone, and the second was the unshakable insistence of the man's wife that he had been killed in his sleep by a vengeful spirit, one that had pursued him halfway across the globe. In 1959, the already troubled kingdom of Laos became the scene of a bloody and brutal civil conflict between an emerging socialist undercurrent and the ruling royalist government. When the populist forces embraced communist ideals, the ongoing war in neighbouring Vietnam subsequently spilled across the borders and into the tiny country. In the face of advancing North Vietnamese armies and assisted by covert CIA military assets who were desperate to see the takeover fail, the Hmong sided with the Laotian government forces. It was a decision they would come to regret. By 1975, public unrest in the United States had led to the complete withdrawal of American forces from the Vietnamese theatre of war, leaving the Hmong at the mercy of the victorious communists. The Laotian royal family would eventually perish in the nightmarish prison camps that they were thrown into, and huge swaths of the ethnic Hmong population would be massacred, accused of being puppets and lackeys of the defeated Americans. Those that were able to flee headed for the border with Thailand, with 50,000 Hmong eventually finding their way to the United States, where they were granted asylum. It was then that these strange deaths started to occur. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, increasing numbers of Hmong migrants who had settled in America started to violently panic in their sleep and then suddenly pass away. In all, over 100 of their number would perish in this manner, with no obvious indication or reason why. For over a decade, the authorities remained baffled by what was happening until the stories of the survivors began to emerge. Wang Qiong was amongst the first 1,000 migrants to reach the safety of America and one of a significant number who had settled in Chicago. Shortly after his arrival, he was asleep in bed one night when he sensed another presence in the room near to where he was lying. It was then that he became aware of a tall, pale-skinned woman watching him intently from the end of his bed. Qiong found that he was unable to move and was forced to watch with growing horror as the slender figure slowly climbed up onto the bed and then deliberately lowered her body onto his, crushing his chest. As the stranger stared angry and unblinking down into his terrified eyes, he felt his breathing start to become restricted and laboured. When Qiong tried to cry out for help, he found he could not even open his mouth, unable to do anything other than stare at the hateful female features that hovered mere inches above his face. Whenever he tried to shift his body to one side in order to relieve the relentless pressure that weighed down on his lungs, the female intruder would match the movement, continuing to press down hard onto his torso. For the next 15 minutes, unable to move to any real extent or cry out for help, Qiong could feel his life slowly ebbing away. His vision became blurred, and his breathing gradually slowed, with darkness starting to envelop him. Throughout this, his attacker wore a mixed expression of condemnation and hostility, neither moving nor speaking. As he felt the last few traces of breath leaving his body, the figure that was lying on top of him suddenly disappeared, instantly releasing the crushing weight on his chest. He fell sideways out of bed, clawing desperately at his throat and sucking down huge lungfuls of oxygen. As his eyes darted nervously around his bedroom, the young man could see no trace of the woman. Only the memory of her hate-filled eyes remained. As he sat gasping for air on the floor, Qiong realized that he had just been paid a visit by the Dab Tsog. Also known as the Night Hag, the Tsog was one of a number of horrific monsters that populated the culture and folklore of the Far East. Others included the Mananangau, a form of winged vampire that sought out pregnant victims, using its long tongue to suck the blood from their unborn babies. There was also the gruesome Pain and Gallon, a cannibalistic entity that took the form of a beautiful woman by day, but whose head separated from her body at night and floated across the field searching for prey, its entrails and spinal column dragging along behind it. The Tsog was a similarly nocturnal creature, dwelling underground or in mountain caves by day and roaming the countryside during the hours of darkness. It would sneak into residences and suffocate unsuspecting humans, stealing their souls as they died. Protection from these creatures could be achieved in the form of sacrifices and offerings to a family's departed ancestors, who would reward these acts of remembrance by watching over and protecting their loved ones. Descriptions of the Dab Tsog varied from survivor to survivor, suggesting that it possessed the ability to use its victims' fears and anxieties against them. In some cases it was only a shadowy outline, in others a fully defined person. Sometimes it would be clothed, on other occasions naked. The only common feature was that the entity always manifested as female in appearance, ranging in age from a young girl to an elderly woman. The attacks were not restricted to the United States, seeming to occur wherever the Laotian refugees had settled. There were further cases of deaths attributed to the Dab Tsog within Hmong settlements in Thailand and Singapore, where records show that over 230 fit and healthy males died painfully and unexpectedly in their sleep, during the same time frame as the deaths in America. The stories related by the handful of victims who had managed to survive the encounters sent shockwaves throughout the rest of their community. There were cases of young Hmong men not sleeping for an entire week, using coffee and drugs to stay awake beyond the point of exhaustion, for fear of being murdered as they slept. Then gradually, the number of deaths began to fall, and by the start of the 1990s, there were no more incidents attributed to the Tsog. So are we to believe that the tragic deaths of over 100 American residents during the early 1980s were caused by a malevolent paranormal or supernatural entity that had followed them to their new home on the other side of the world? It's an argument that perhaps unsurprisingly failed to convince the US authorities, who attributed the Hmong deaths to a slew of other medical and societal factors. The cases were classified in official reports as sudden unexpected nocturnal death syndrome, or SUNDS for short. A number of frequently occurring features were identified from examining the SUNDS cases as a whole. With only one solitary exception, the victims were all male. They were middle-aged, averaging somewhere between 33 and 34 years old. They had also died within the first 17 months of their arrival in the United States, and whilst an exact cause of death would prove impossible to pin down, a closer examination of the bodies did manage to highlight shared symptoms in at least some of the cases. Chicago pathologist Dr. Frederick Eckner reported that in 17 of the 18 bodies that he had been asked to investigate, small defects were present within the tiny fibers that carried the electrical impulses from the brain to the heart. These fibers were found to be frayed and curled, much like a fuse that had been overloaded and burnt out. He hypothesized that the hearts of the dead men had suddenly stopped working because of an immediate and wholly unexpected electrical discharge, the type of discharge created by the body's nervous system in times of extreme stress and anxiety. In short, while sleeping at night, the victims appeared to have been killed by their own nightmares. Other theories that were brought forward seized upon the high levels of depression that were present in the Hmong community. In addition to the anticipated stresses and strains of the panicked flight from Laos, many of the migrants also admitted to possessing an unhealthy degree of survivor guilt, feeling as if they had abandoned their friends and families to die at the hands of the victorious communist authorities. The way that American society treated the newcomers did little to help their fragile mental health. The Hmong were often mistaken for either Vietnamese or Korean nationals by their new neighbours, which resulted in verbal and physical abuse. The American people were understandably exhausted and outraged by 20 years of bloody conflict in the Far East. There were many cases of aggression and violence towards the migrants, which was particularly sad, given that so many ethnic Hmong soldiers had died fighting against the communists. Increased levels of stress can sometimes cause significant sleep deprivation, and one possible side effect of this is a disorder known as sleep paralysis. This is exceptionally common, believed to affect up to 50% of adults at some point during their lives. During a paralysis episode, as the body is on the verge of falling asleep or about to wake, the subject temporarily enters a state where they believe they are conscious but cannot move. This can sometimes lead to hallucinations, with visions of intruders or strange demonic entities often reported by those who have experienced it. However, it is not usually fatal. Could the overwhelming stresses of integrating into a new culture and the observed defects in the nerve fibers have combined to turn this usually terrifying but harmless disorder into a deadly condition? It's an interesting question. There is also the possibility that the nervous and immune systems of the Hmong could simply not adapt to the pollution-heavy environment they now found themselves living in. In their Laotian homeland, they had lived off a natural and healthy diet. The rural communities enjoyed much cleaner air and extremely low rates of heart disease. Now residing in congested cities, choked by exhaust fumes and industrial pollution, and with cheap and easy access to fast foods, containing ingredients their bodies were just not accustomed to, there was a significant increase in their levels of congenital illness. The narrative provided by the migrants is a compelling one when viewed objectively. The fact that no children or old people were ever involved in the incidents certainly seems to indicate some form of targeting or sentient intelligence to the attacks. There is also an argument as to why the time frame in which the deaths occurred is so narrow. The move to America was a huge cultural shock to most Laotians, and it was their efforts to adapt and integrate into American society that allowed the So to enter into their lives. The communist purge in Laos killed many Hmong elders and shamans, the people who had been tasked with keeping the Dab Tsog and other monsters at bay. The legend says that when the survivors settled in the United States, the amount of holy men amongst their number had dwindled to such an extent that there was now little in place to guard against the attacks by the night hag. Customs of sacrifices and offerings that had kept them safe in their beds whilst in Laos were slowly forgotten, removing the protection their ancestors had traditionally provided for them. With very few Hmong left in Laos to target, the Dab Tsog were also forced to leave their homeland, setting off in pursuit of the few believers that still feared them. For a brief period, they were able to hunt and kill with impunity, but their eagerness to steal the souls of their victims would also eventually be their undoing. As they gleefully called the middle-aged bracket of survivors, the older migrants who believed in them also passed away from natural causes, but a significant portion of younger migrants ended up converting to Christianity, and in a short space of time, the number of Hmong who believed in the So had all but disappeared. Scientists and doctors who have examined sons have never been able to conclusively diagnose the exact reason why the nervous system of the victims failed, but from the observations of Dr. Eckner, it seems apparent that the cause was psychological, rather than any kind of external factor, possibly related to a form of sleep paralysis. Something very painful and persistent was embedded in the depths of the Hmong culture, something that exposed the migrants to events of extreme anxiety, so extreme that it proved fatal for the minds of some of the people involved. Perhaps the most important question to be asked when examining the case of the Dab Tsog is this: what exactly is an evil spirit? Is it, as traditionally conceived, a paranormal entity possessing its own consciousness, acting with malicious will and intent? Or is it something we manufacture in our minds, a form of subconscious projection that we manifest in response to events that are taking place around us? Whichever of those answers you subscribe to, there is little doubt that the Hmong migrants who died in their sleep were killed as a result of the most extreme level of stress and anxiety they had ever faced. Whether that was because of a paranormal entity or one they imagined because of the awful situation they had been exposed to is irrelevant. They still died at the hands of the Dab Tsog. And what makes this case even more compelling is the fact that the vision of the night hag is so common in episodes of sleep paralysis, even in Western culture, that one has to wonder how and why so many people witness the same entity all over the world. The sheer hopelessness and helplessness of the manner in which these people perished is easily one of the most tragic cases we have examined. We take comfort in the hope that sharing this story keeps the memory of those who died alive, and that whatever forces were at work in claiming them will never return.